Welcome to the $200 Linndrum, otherwise known as an MPX16 by Kai. So, basic Linndrum sounds. I have them organized in groups. Typically, I'm programming this either from my DAW or from the BeatStep Pro. Because it doesn't have a sequencer in it, so you will need some way to sequence these drums. The main reason I picked this up was Superior Drummer. As much as I love it, it's not as accessible for the blind user. So I like knob per function. I'm big on having hands-on controls because it just makes things faster than having somebody come in and either make presets, which is what I've done. So I have huge lists of presets in Sonar, which is what I'm using because it's adapted for the blind user. So this allows me to escape the software limitations of having presets and actually be able to do things like tune the drums, which is one of, I think, the best aspects of this. It's got a decent range. Now that's a beefy snare drum. Yeah. Tune down the claps. Where are the claps? So it's usable in that way. I like that. These four knobs on the right hand side change as you go through the menus. So I have to memorize the menus in order to know what each one of these knobs do. Or I refer to the notepad that I make with my wife. When I get a new piece of gear, I go through it systematically and label out all of the... I do it by sections generally. So I would start from the left, and this first section would be the top volume knob, and then the bottom knob for mic input for the built-in microphone on the sampler section. So I'd call this section 1. These possibly these two. I haven't looked at the notepad to see what the two sample edit functions are, because I don't use the internal mic to create samples. I make them externally and put them on the SD card, which is fairly easy. It's kind of picky in terms of the format it will take. It has to be stripped of all metadata, which in Sonar I thought it was doing. It didn't look like it was exporting with anything, but these samples would not play. So I had to load them into Audacity. So that added another step. I had to export from Sonar, import into Audacity, export from Audacity onto the SD card, and then they work. So whatever Audacity is doing differently from Sonar, it just works correctly. So really what this is all about is usability for me. You can build different drum kits, which is pretty cool. I have a 707 kit in here, an 808, so SP12, an MFB kit. What else? I got a Atari kit, cartridge kit, a lot of different combo kits where this is relatively straightforward. Linndrum. I don't think these cymbals came from the Linndrum because if I remember correctly, some of the Linndrum samples were not favorites of mine. The majority of them are Linndrum. And since I can't afford an actual Linndrum, which is ideally what we'd get, this is the closest thing, aside from VST, that will allow me to do all the things on a drum machine. Majority of the things the drum machine could do, with the exception of multi-outs. So in terms of the sampler, it does allow some basic functions that are harder to use as a blind user, like sample adjustment, like start and end times. So it's pretty good with that. These same four buttons allow you to adjust how your sample sounds. So you can really play with it. You can have you can make them into synths by shortening the waveform to the point where it's just a piece of the sound. So it is flexible like that. So I will put to come back to how I look at a piece of gear, I will put in the description the notepad that I use to label out all of the sections and the menus and how they work with each sub-menu. So, we'll go through it and we'll push it, and we'll find what each sub-menu has. So I can then go through it and count the number of button pushes that I'm doing. So, like I said, some of the problems with this machine are the lack of multi-outs. So I do have to do a lot of hard panning for each drum. So in order to render a sound, I would put kick and snare on the same MIDI track, hard pan them left and right. Same thing would go for like toms. I'd have to put tom 1 hard left, tom 2 hard right, and then if there was a third tom or a fourth tom, I'd have to do another run with that off its own MIDI track. So the toms would be a separate MIDI track. Hi-hats and claps would be their own MIDI track, and hard pan hats left, hard pan claps right. Yeah, so it gets the job done, but it's a lot slower than working with a VST, which just separates the tracks for you, which is really nice. Another thing with this machine is the slow load times between banks. So if you have a lot of really long samples, it can take a good minute. Like I've noticed, like between some of the longer sample load times, you're just sitting there. So as a live tool, you'd have to be ready to entertain the crowd in between these set changes, unless your drum sounds are short. Like these Linndrum samples are pretty short. The 707 kit's short, so it loads relatively fast. So in that way, it's usable. And it doesn't drop samples like the MPX8 did, which is why I replaced it with this thing. Is I was having problems with it just dropping drum sounds altogether, which makes it not so usable as anything if you can't rely on it to repeat your MIDI output. Another problem is ground noise. This unit is kind of loud. So like I've got it running into the front of my audio interface, partially because I like to gain the drum sounds, which is another reason why I like an external piece of gear, because I can add a little bit of, quote, color to it by cranking the gain. So like on the snare, which is one of my... So it does give you a little bit of flexibility with that, which I like. However, the ground noise, if you listen to this, I do have a gate on this. It might not come through, but... So you can hear that. That's fairly loud ground noise, but that's with pretty high gain. So I do have it gated, so I'm avoiding that whole problem. You might be able to hear it when I actually hit the sample, like the... It's okay. It's there, but it's workable. Trigger, oh yeah, so the loop changes sometimes don't save. So if you have a sound that's on some kind of repeated loop, it doesn't always save the state you last left it in. You might find out when you open that the same thing you've been using all along, and one day you open it up and the loop state has changed. So I just power it off because it'll go back to generally what you had it in. Another problem is MIDI is only available on channel 1, which if you have a ton of synths is a pain in the ass. So I had to change around my setup in order to use this thing. MIDI 1 was my primary synth, which was a DSI Prophet 8. It was my main controller, so I had that set as 1. So I had to rearrange this and put this as the MPX as channel 1, the Moog Sub 37 as channel 2, and the Prophet 8 as 3. Which comes, really you'll notice that as you're playing with multiple. So you've got the Moog on channel 2 and the Prophet on channel 3. It's no big deal. It just took some reworking of the setup. So when you open old projects that don't have your new setup, you have to reconnect everything. So here is, let's see how it sounds with the sequencer. So I generally sequence this with my DAW or the BeatStep Pro, which I have below. You won't be able to see what I'm doing, but you can hear it. sub 37. And now the profit on top. Welcome to 1985 in 2019. So, this has been my basic overview of a $200 Linndrum. I'm hoping Behringer, or ideally Roger Linn, comes out with a new version of the Linndrum because I want one. So hopefully in the future I will do a review of using an actual Linndrum. Wouldn't that be awesome? So if you like this video, please like it and subscribe and share it and do all those good things good YouTubers do. Thanks for watching.